started an inquisition in Toledo under Juan II, I believe, under a priest named Oropesa, that largely ended up vindicating the new Christians. So they had no reason to believe that the Inquisition would prove it to be the bloody instrument that it became. But the inquisitors that they appointed, who were largely Dominicans, had a different playbook, literally a playbook left over from the initial Inquisition instituted against the Cathars, and they very quickly took up a much more aggressive stance, arresting the major leaders of the Converso community, torturing them, burning them at the stake. Finally, the only thing that stopped them in Seville was their own mortality. The Black Plague broke out, and they finally had to flee the city. But they forced the Conversos to remain. And what they did, through torture, through compulsion, was to uncover huge reams of evidence to show that there was heresy in Seville. And with that evidence, the king and queen could no longer deny the Inquisition claim that heresy was endemic throughout all of Spain, and the Inquisition needed to be broadened and extended through the rest of the country. So it did. Eventually, under the leadership of Tomás de Torquemada, an elderly man, a Dominican in his 60s, who was a great administrator, and began to institutionalize the Inquisition and push for its expansion. It suffered opposition when they tried to go into Aragon, since it was seen as a foreign institution from Castile that violated the fueros, or nationalistic rights, of the Aragon nation. But an unwise attempt to assassinate one of the inquisitors by some of the conversos allowed him to become a martyr and popularize Inquisition in Aragon, and so it spread through both the kingdoms. Now I'm running way ahead of my notes, so excuse me. Now, the Inquisition had limited jurisdiction against the Jews. It was directed against the conversos. But it did have some jurisdiction, because it could move against the Jews if the Jews committed heresy against Christians. And this led in 1491 to a blood libel trial, where one converso and 6 Jews were accused. Blood libel is the common belief in Europe at the time that Jews would murder Christian babies in rituals in order to gain magical power. And they accused these Jews of the ritual killing of the Santo Niño de la Guardia. And they were eventually, after being tortured for over a year, they were eventually put to death. The myth of the Santo Niño de la Guardia still exists in Spain. This is the chapel to the Holy Child. And if you go on YouTube, you can see the parishioners singing the hymn to the Holy Child, even though there was never any account of a missing child at the time, and the inquisitors made no efforts to actually try to find a body of a child, even after extracting confessions from the Jews that they supposedly killed and tortured the child. The importance of these events is believed because it wasn't published until much later. Eventually it became a popular legend. It was believed that the inquisitors used this as a weapon to convince the king and queen that the Jews needed to go. And whether it was that did it, or just the constant pressure of the Inquisition, this pleading eventually worked. And on March 31st, 1492, King Fernando signed the expulsion decree. Do I have that here? Yep. That's the expulsion decree ordering all Jews to leave Spain within, I think it was 90 days. He placed onerous restrictions on them. They had to do a fire sale of all their holdings. They could only bring a certain amount of money out of Spain. They couldn't bring gold. And these restrictions both reflected the economic importance of the Jews, although most of that importance had been supplanted by the conversos. And one of the reasons why he was able to sign the expulsion edict was that the marriage of convenience that led to Jewish success up to that point was no longer needed, because the Jews were no longer important in Castile or Aragon. Because of the mass conversions, their economic and cultural and other roles had been supplanted by the conversos. And expulsion had become the norm in Europe. The Jews had been expelled from England, and they had been expelled from France. So there was nothing, the European leaders, including intellectuals such as some of the Italian humanists, they all thought this is a normal decree. So they had to leave. Where did they go? Some of them, before I do that, let me read to you from a contemporary account by the priest André Bermaldez, who wrote a history of the period. He was a country priest who was conservative. He supported the Inquisition, and he supported the expulsion, but he wrote a remarkably sympathetic account of what happened to the Jews who were facing the expulsion order. And here's his description. And foregoing the glory of all this and confiding in the vain hopes of their blindness, they, the Jews, took to the difficulties of the road and left the lands of their birth, the large and the small, the old and the young, on foot and riding on donkeys and other beasts of burdens and on carts. And they continued their journeys, each one into the ports of destination. And they went by the roads and fields with great difficulties and misfortunes, some falling, others rising up, others dying, others being born, others becoming sick, that there was not a Christian who did not feel their pain. Always, whenever they went, they were invited to be baptized, and some in their misery converted and stayed, but very few did so. And the rabbis were encouraging them, and made the women and young men sing, and made them play timbrels and frame drums in order to make the people happy. And thus they left Castile and arrived at ports where some boarded ships and others went on to Portugal. Now, there weren't that many places they could go to. France was closed off to them because France had expelled their Jews. The kingdom of Fez in Morocco welcomed them in. It was a very difficult journey. They faced piracy. They faced extortion. Once they got there, they faced fire and famine. Some of them had to face so much misery when they got to Fez that they had to return to Spain, where they were allowed to go back, provided they converted to Christianity. The easiest place to get to was Portugal. But Portugal required them to pay an onerous tax and only gave a small portion of them actual right to live in Portugal. The other ones were only given a temporary right to abode. There was no other place to go, so those with temporary right stayed to their detriment. Some of them, because the king of Portugal, King João, ended up grabbing up many of the children, the male children of the people who didn't pay the tax and weren't allowed to stay. He enslaved them. He converted them to Christianity. He exported them to the deserted island of São Tomé and mixed them with African slaves to start an experimental slave sugar plantation. He was eventually succeeded by King Manuel, who initially looked very favorably on the Jews. He released all he reversed a lot of the repressive acts taken by King João. But King João then decided to marry the daughter of Fernando and Isabel. And she had a dowry, and her dowry was he had to get rid of his Jews. Because the king and queen of Spain didn't want to have to go through all the problems of expulsion and then find all the Jews were still back on their doorstep. And if the kingdoms were ever to unite again, which was always a possibility, they'd end up with the same Jews. So he faced the dilemma. He didn't want to get rid of the Jews, but he had to do something. He eventually tried to extort them to convert. He grabbed many of their children. He forcibly converted them and then said that they could only return their parents if the parents converted. That didn't work, so finally, in desperation, he just rounded them all up. He threw holy water on them and said, "Now you're Christian." It's called the general conversion. Didn't really work. About 20 years later, there was anti-converso riots In Portugal, this is a time when the Black Plague was raging and the king was in retreat, and thousands of conversos, or probably Jews, were killed. This is a memorial set up in the main plaza in Lisbon today, in memory of the thousands of Jews who were killed during those anti-converso riots. So let me, I only have a few more minutes. Let me just briefly indicate one of the most important results of this. I talked about the Toledo imposition of racial exclusion and racial restrictions. This would become a very important practice because it was eventually popularized through all of Castile and Aragon. It became the first racial exclusion laws in the modern world. It became known as the limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood laws, where people, conversos, were excluded from office if they had Jewish blood. The idea of race, the word race, comes out of this. Race first began to be used in the modern sense to refer to people in 15th century Spain of Jewish descent. And the idea of race, which is generally considered to be a modern construct that comes from the discovery of biological principles of inheritance of characteristics, was used against people of Jewish descent, and inheritance of characteristics wasn't based on biology, but on religion. Conversos inherited bad characteristics through a curse because of their role in the deicide and the killing of Jesus. And that curse couldn't even be erased by baptism, since baptism, which erases, it was akin to original sin. Baptism erases original sin, but since the sin of killing Jesus took place after the rite of baptism was initiated, even baptism couldn't erase that sin. And so limpieza de sangre became very common in Spain, particularly during the 15th century. I'm going to go through this very quickly because I don't have much time. And when the Spanish and the Portuguese then conquered the New World, took from the Arabs the institutions both of sugar cultivation, sugar plantations, and African slavery, they used that as a template, limpieza de sangre, to begin racial distinctions in the New World. And so the discrimination against the Jews led to discrimination against Africans and was the birth of modern racism. Let me just quote from a modern historian, and then I'll end or leave it for questions. David Bryan Davis, the prominent American historian who wrote A History of American Slavery and Human Bondage, wrote, "In one of history's bitter ironies, it was the Spanish and Portuguese treatment of Jews that provided the final seabed for Christian negrophobic racism, including the desire to make the use of black labor while protecting the purity of white blood. In other words, there's much evidence that the Christians' growing fears and anxieties over the mass conversion and intermixture of Jews in late medieval Spain gave rise to a more general concern over purity of blood, limpieza de sangre in Spanish, and just to an early conception of biological race." And that's all I got time for. Any questions? Questions? There has to be a microphone. Yeah.
Got it coming back.
Thank you. Quite a presentation. I have recently become struck by something in the common intellectual history, and that is that modern Kabbalism, as I understand it, started in Provence and moved to Andalusia. Ibn al-Arabi was out of the Umayyad or Ayyubid court in Damascus, where a lot of the real intellectual firepower of the Muslims came. And there was this great period of mysticism, and it was also, I mean, in Christendom, to be a little fair to them, since we haven't been so, you know, I mean, they've been rough. Meister Eckhart lived in this period too.
Yeah.
What was this something out of Spain? Was this a?
I have a whole chapter in my book on the Zohar, which was written by Moses de Leon in 13th century Spain. The Zohar, the Kabbalah was a radical restructuring of Jewish thought, a mystical restructuring that may have been influenced by the Cathars, who were a Gnostic mystic heretical sect. And Moses de Leon wrote maybe the most important text of the Kabbalah, called the Zohar, or the Book of Splendor. And I have a whole chapter in my book about it. I mean, that's a great point, a great question, and I think there is a lot there. And again, I devote a whole chapter to it, but it's too complicated for me to get into. But I entirely agree with you. We can talk about it later if you like, or you could read my chapter. Yeah, sure.
Yes. How many Jews and conversos were there, say, in the 15th century, as either in numbers or as a percentage of the population? And also, were there any significant numbers of Jewish conversos to Islam?
There probably weren't significant numbers of. There was some forced conversion to Islam under the Almohads, under the repressive. And in fact, there's some belief Maimonides' family may have been forcibly converted, but that took place in Morocco, because of the fundamentalist Islamic tribes were engaging in some forced conversions. There was a lot of repression, particularly in Yemen, that caused Maimonides to write a book called The Consolation for the Converted, I think. It was a letter that he wrote to them where he said that he thought that if the choice was to convert or die, that it was not sinful to convert in form, as long as you could revert to Judaism as soon as you can. And that letter became very useful to the conversos under the Christian period later on. But it didn't happen to the mass extent it did under the Christian period. I'm sorry. Oh, and numbers, there aren't any good numbers. Bermaldez, who I quote here, estimated numbers who were expelled were about 150,000. And certainly maybe 5% of the population of Spain at the time they think might have been Jewish. But there aren't any good statistics.
Yes. What was the role for Ottoman Empire during the expulsion?
I'm sorry?
What was the role of Ottoman Empire?
Well, famously, the Ottoman Empire, after the expulsion, did invite, apparently the head of the Ottoman Empire said he would welcome Jews in. But the Ottoman Empire was not easy to access from Spain. And so initially, there probably was relatively little emigration. But eventually, many of the conversos ended up in outposts of the Ottoman Empire, particularly the part of the Ottoman Empire that was in Europe. And you find them in, say, Thessalonica in Greece. Had a very big Jewish population. So they did eventually become welcoming, and the Jews found a home there. But that took a while, because it was hard to get there.
I have a question.
Sure.
Firstly, can you restate the name of that island that you said that the young Jewish men were sent to?
It was San Tome.
San Tome.
Yeah.
Okay. And then
S-A-L, Sao Tome.
Sao Tome. And then secondly, I wanted to ask, what was the Jewish involvement, if any, with regards to the exploration of Christopher Columbus? I've heard and read that he may have been a Jew, or is there any truth to that, or do you talk about that in your book at all?
Well, I don't deal with whether he was. Some people believe he was of Jewish descent, and I don't deal with that. But there certainly were. I have a whole chapter at the end of my book called "Coming to America" about the Jewish role in the settlements in America, particularly in Brazil, where the Dutch used them. And so that the city of Recife in 1630 was a third to half Jewish and had 2 synagogues. But we know that there were conversos on the boat of Columbus, because Columbus wrote in his journal, he bragged that he had one sailor in the boat who could speak Hebrew and Chaldean, which I think he meant Aramaic. And the reason why he bragged about it was he was concerned that they might meet the lost tribes at the end of his voyage, and so he wanted to have someone who could talk to these, if you know the story of the lost tribes of Jews, who could talk to them once they got there and met the lost tribes. So we know there was at least one and probably a number of conversos on the voyage.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. We've been able to trace our family roots back to the Halevi family in Spain, so it really is pertinent. Also, the Jews, when they left, many of them did get to the Spanish Netherlands, and then others certainly through Genoa and other ports in Italy got into Central and Eastern Europe too.
Right, that came out. That was after the Portuguese conversion, because the Netherlands became open after the 7 Years' War, when they developed the principles of religious tolerance, and were actually, because they'd been repressed by the Catholics, were much more anti-Catholic than anti-Jewish. And I talk about that in my last chapter, Coming to America, because they used the Jews to explore to exploit the their New World colonies. And that's why there were major Jewish colonies in Brazil when they conquered Pernambuco in northern Brazil, and later on after they were kicked out by the Portuguese in Curacao, and the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, which had the first congregation, open Jewish congregation in what's now the United States in the 1600s. One more. Okay, right there. Yeah.
Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I was curious about the term Sepharad. Where does that come from?
Right. Well, my book is called Exiles in Sepharad, and the term comes from the book of Obadiah. And it was a passage which goes something like, the Jews who were in Israel and are now in Sepharad. And so the Spanish Jews picked on that as a prediction, sort of a prophecy. They identified Spain with Sepharad, the word Sepharad in the Bible, and they picked on that as a prophecy that this was prophesied to be the home of the Jews after the destruction of Israel. So that's where that comes from. So they took the name on them from themselves, from the Bible. Spain. Although it's unlikely that the original reference referred to Spain. Did you have a question? We have to wait. Or you won't be recorded for posterity if you don't. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the history of the conversos after the Jews left. And you still had all of this huge number of people who were identified as conversos. Right. And I know that up to this point, there doesn't seem to be any Jews left in Spain. And when I visited it last, even the Jewish sites that are now popular tourist attractions, it's Spanish non-Jews who are the ones who are the tour guides there. So what was the history of the rest of the conversos?
I mean, in Spain, the Inquisition was a very effective institution, and it operated until Napoleon.